Welcome to another episode of The Learning Curve. I'm your host, Julia McLeod. Before we begin, please join me in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, enable me to teach with wisdom, for I help to shape the mind. Equip me to teach with truth, for I help to shape the conscience. Encourage me to teach with vision, for I help to shape the future. Empower me to teach with love, for I help to shape the world. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of Treaty 6 and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4, in which many Indigenous peoples have come before us to call home. We acknowledge the contributions that the Indigenous peoples have provided to help shape our past, present, and our future. We commit to restoring and honoring the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and believe that together our collective communities can build a stronger understanding of all people who dwell on this land and who call it home. We are recording from our beautiful home at Lumen Christi. Today's episode is called Narrative Inquiry for Reflective Practice. The agenda for the episode begins with our TSA segment, Tricky Situations in Assessment with Nicole Lafreniere, our Director of Curriculum and Assessment. In this segment, Nicole will help us navigate and land on solutions to difficult situations in assessment. This will be followed with an interview with Tracy Halusawascu, who is one of the assessment and reporting consultants with Learning Services. Tracy is going to guide us through a narrative inquiry that showcases her learning journey throughout her career. We will also have the segment, We're Still Doing That, with Deputy Superintendent Tim Cusack, where he will help us explore outdated assessment practices and offer solutions to help us move forward. That's the plan for today. Let's jump in. Ms. Sanchez has been teaching for 2 years. She is part of a science department that has an established assessment system. They have common formative and summative assessments, as well as dates for delivering exams. Ms. Sanchez wants to try the concept of ungrading in her classroom, but she fears that this does not align with her department or school. What do you advise? Ms. Sanchez?
So I think that Miss Sanchez, the very first thing that she needs to do is think about the research. So once she's determined, you know what, I think that I want to do this, I think it's very fair to go to her department head and maybe during a department meeting say, you know, I know that this is going to be a little bit risky, but I'd like to try it. And here's the reason why. And just be really upfront with some of those things that she would like to try and say maybe she doesn't take it all on at once. Maybe she looks at it in small chunks, and really opening that professional dialogue. I think that we shy away from risk overall as human beings. Risk is uncomfortable, but it's also in that risky space that we actually can grow a little bit. So finding out, you know, what does her department feel about that? Might there be a person who wants to take that on with her and have those conversations? I think that when it comes to ungrading and it comes to do we have zeros, nobody really wants to have a zero. We all understand the notion of measuring achievement and not behavior. The question becomes one of practicality. It's not one of philosophy. How is it going to work in real life? It's not that we disagree with it in concept. So I think that Ms. Sanchez needs to give herself a little bit of freedom to have a little bit of risk and see how it works. And then also build that culture within her classroom to say, we're going to try this, because what I've noticed, everyone, is that this hasn't been going super well in terms of everybody handing in their assignments on time. So maybe even also saying, how can we all work together to make sure that this works? Rather than giving you an assignment that's 2 weeks away, and then expecting everybody to hand it in. What's going to work so that we can all work together towards this particular goal? And one of the things that I've noticed and this is just an extension from real life, this is a real life example, is that it does change the conversation when we move away from a competitive kind of, I'm getting this grade, I need to win, I need to a sense of, we're going to do this. It's like the shift in board games away from a monopoly style, I'm going to win or take all, to a cooperative style game. There's still a sense of, we want to win, but we're winning now together. So how do we all move forward together? So it's establishing that culture within your classroom as well.
Welcome to the show, Tracy.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about the relationship between teacher identity and student identity, and also that acknowledgement that we were students once before we became teachers, and how all of this can play into the story of who we are. So before we begin, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your career so far?
For sure. I began my career in 2000, started with Edmonton Catholic Schools, and I've been with Edmonton Catholic Schools ever since. I started in an elementary school, Bishop Greszczyk, and started with grade 6. My first year of teaching was an extraordinary position, likely because I had such an amazing support network. I had 2 other grade 6 teachers who are continue to be in the division. A shout out to Darren DeForge and Janina Rezes. They were amazing mentors, and there was amazing leadership at that school. So I started off my career in a place where students really had a voice. There was a lot of inquiry happening, and the things that we did were really exciting. So it was a really great start to my career. After that, I moved to more traditional ways, or schools where there was more traditional ways of teaching. And so that definitely was difficult in my second year, where I was, asked to kind of teach in a school where it was, the model was more stand and deliver. And so that really conflicted with my identity as a teacher and what I thought to be right for kids. I challenged that narrative, and I did my best to kind of work through that. After that, I moved again, as all new teachers do within their first few years, and then settled in as a grade 6 teacher. And then from there, moved into site literacy coordinator, reading recovery teacher. And I always was connected with grade 6 math. That was kind of a passion for me. So during that time, I again found some challenges with the way that really felt natural for me as a teacher and in interacting with my students, kind of some traditional ways of teaching and learning. I would, people would make comments to me about, must be nice to have so much time on your hands, because I would put in the little extra efforts in the school and try and really make things engaging with my students. And I found that to be really difficult. So I had my children in those years, and after I had my youngest, I had a little break from education because of some medical concerns for him. And then when I came back, I had the opportunity to open up a 100 Voices program at the Terwillegar Community Recreation Center, and it was the first of its kind in a community center. And this experience was something that has, shaped who I am today. It really felt like I was coming home. I had an educational team that I could collaborate with, and also being outside of a school, I didn't feel the pressures to conform to, that dominant narrative of what sometimes is happening in schools. We didn't have to live by bells. We didn't have to go to, do things with our youngest learners that maybe weren't super meaningful for them. So this experience showed me and taught me to be really critical on, if we're engaging in experiences with children and with students, are we doing them because that's what tradition says, or are we doing them because it's actually educative for these kids? And so we, as a team, I had the most amazing team there, thought critically about every decision and challenged kind of that dominant narrative of what traditional schooling looked like. And for those reasons, it was kind of the pinnacle of my career thus far. And so then after that, I had some opportunities to work with the curriculum prototyping project for Edmonton Catholic Schools, where we got to create a draft curriculum for grades K to 3, a scope and sequence for K to 12, resources, assessments, all of those kind of things. And so that was amazing. I've never worked with such passionate educators in the field as I did at that time. So that was extremely exciting. Went back to 100 Voices for a short stint at the Meadows Community Recreation Center. And then after that, moved into a consulting role with early learning. So I was an early learning consultant for 5 years. And again, that experience of working with early learning teachers, 100 Voices, and kindergarten teachers, again, reinforced so many of the things that I was passionate about and helped me to share some of my experiences with teachers and with, at the time, early learning facilitators and multidisciplinary team. So that was really exciting. At the end of that experience, I was a part of an assessment project with Amy Swinkles. She was also at the time an early learning consultant. So the two of us head up an assessment project with early learning teachers. And so this really sparked my interest for assessment and how assessment can really impact the learning environment, how it is the kind of the precipice to growth and to planning and all of those things. And then in the fall of my last year of early learning consultant, there was an assessment and reporting position that opened up. And that's where I am currently in my career. So I'm currently working as an assessment and reporting consultant for the division. And I'm super passionate about everything assessment and really the impact that it can have on teaching and learning.
Thank you for sharing your story. I think we see some common themes building into the role that you currently hold as assessment and reporting consultant. I understand that you have a master's degree, and why I'm bringing this up is because we're going to talk about one of the courses that you took through the University of Alberta on narrative inquiry. And that theme's already coming up in that first response. We hear a dominant narrative coming up in what you're sharing with us. Can you speak to us a bit about this course and why you want to talk about it today?
Absolutely. So for those of you, anybody who's thinking about doing a master's degree at, it doesn't matter where it is, if you have an opportunity to dig into narrative inquiry, I would highly encourage it. This course at the U of A is offered in the summer as part of an institute, and it's Sean Lessard is one of the leading instructors for this course. It is based on the work of Jean Candini and Michael Conley and their experience with narrative inquiry as a research method. And so when I first read the description of this course, it resonated and connected with me right away, and likely because I was embarking on this journey after my experiences in 100 Voices. And being an educator in 100 Voices, one of the ways that we collect evidence on what students know, understand, and can do, and their experiences in education is through pedagogical documentation. And I couldn't help but just even reading the description to see the connections on this world of pedagogical documentation and narrative inquiry. And although narrative inquiry is like the depth of the research most research projects takes a couple of years to dig into, it really resonated with me. And so when we look at narrative inquiry, it really is the researcher walking alongside the participants, and usually that's a limited amount. It's it's the researcher first of all needs to really examine their own story and how pivotal pieces in their life from their past and their present and even their potential future self, how those situations in place impact how they view the world and how they interact with others, and how connect to the stories that individuals share with them. And within an educational stance, if we think about our relationships with students and how important and powerful those are, if we can walk alongside our students and engage in these into these narratives about their lives, sharing pieces of our own as we do in narrative inquiry, and finding those connections, it is very powerful as to the depth of connection that we'll have with our students, the trust, and all of those pieces that come along with it. So I don't want to mislead you in saying that I think teachers should be doing this in their class. That's not what this is about. What this is about is some of the tenets of this form of inquiry can, if we think in this way of, being situated in our past, present, future, and being like introspective, acknowledging tensions that we have, or sometimes we call that cognitive dissonance, and kind of working through that together, then it can really impact how we interact with our students, as well as how we gather evidence on what they know. Right? We talk about triangulation all the time, and I know teachers within triangulation. Teachers are really comfortable with the product piece, but observations and conversations sometimes we struggle with it, because what if we're challenged? But if we look at it in this way of an interaction and really giving voice to our students, and building that relationship of trust, and ensuring that from the student's perspective, we actually are accurate on what we're demonstrating or what we're presenting, and giving voice to them, then really our understanding of what they know just jumps to a completely different level, because the product, there's a ceiling as to what we can find out from that. So this just makes our experiences general with relationships, with looking at perspective of students, ensuring that we're bridging into that culturally responsive world and taking things into account. It just helps us to get to a better place and understanding alongside our children and with them.
I started my career in the International Baccalaureate, so teaching 4 years in the elementary program and the junior high program, and the IB asks teachers to engage in reflective practice, and because I was a beginning teacher, I didn't really understand what that meant. I thought it was just this box at the end of our unit plans to kind of reflect on what went well, what didn't go well in relation to the unit that I was teaching. But I think what you're talking about today levels up that reflective practice. It's that introspection that you're talking about, how we look at who we are as teachers, what has influenced us in the past, and continues to influence our perspectives today. So can you share a bit about what you had to do in this class to look in on your own story in learning and in education?
Absolutely. So one of the things, and probably my most favorite part of this class, was this ability to be introspective, to look at my own journey in life and in education. So not just within education, but really take a look and take a step back as to the things that have really impacted me in my life. And so one of the things that they ask you to do if you are a researcher, and I was not a researcher in narrative inquiry, I would love to be, but one of the things that they ask you to do is to start by writing your own timeline. And in narrative inquiry, they call this an annal. And so you look at your past and your present, and you start to mark up some significant things that happen within education, within your childhood, whether that's the death of a loved one, a grandparent, something within education where there was a turning point for you, those kind of things. So you make this timeline, you sit with it, and then you start to reflect based on the readings of Candini and Conley, their teachings and the kind of methodology behind narrative inquiry, and how this impacts your thinking as you sit with each of these impactful experiences within your life. And so it's interesting that sometimes we don't realize that things were really impactful until we sit back and we give ourselves time and space to think about them. And so as I looked at my timeline, because this was one of the parts that I was able to engage with, there was one particular thing that really stood out to me educationally. And Candini and Conley talk a lot about, they refer a lot to Dewey's work and this idea of what is educative and what is non-educative. And so how in school, even though we're in the business of teaching and learning, there are things that students learn that might actually not be very helpful to their identity building, even to who they are as a person. So I kind of looked back on that, and the one thing that kind of stuck out to me was my entry into education and the identity that I didn't realize was part of my identity until I looked at this as a struggling reader that was storied by others on what I was referred to, the labels that I had as a struggling reader early on in my education. And so looking back, moving forward from that experience in primary, where I was labeled as a struggling reader, I was given extra support, all the things that we do that teachers feel are really beneficial. But that label and that being pulled out for things, and it being perpetuated, even just the division of classes when I was in grade 6, where they had a lower performing class. There was 2 grade 6 classes, and they actually, for English language arts, they mixed them between low and high. And they may not have called it that, but every student in the low class knew that. And so then when I fast forward and I move into even my junior high and senior high and post-secondary, and to this date, I still in many ways see myself as a struggling reader, even as a person with 3 degrees. That identity is still ingrained and entrenched in who I am. And so I think that's really important, and it's in, and then I was, again, as I moved forward, I did have opportunities to restory my narrative through positive experiences with reading, or things where others in my career lifted me up. And so that is something that can happen. Do I still have an identity of, do I still feel uncomfortable if somebody puts a piece of paper in front of me that I haven't had a chance to pre-read? Absolutely. But through education and being successful and persisting and having some amazing teachers, one in particular that I remember in primary, who at the time, I went to school, over 35 years ago was this experience. So the things that teachers had access to weren't the same as we do now. We all read the same readers, all that kind of stuff. And one teacher in particular actually removed covers from things, and so that it appeared like I was reading the same as everything else. She wanted me to be able to fit in, and she kind of did whatever she could within the classroom environment to support me in my journey. But it was really, as a 100 Voices teacher, I think one of the pivotal moments for me was sharing my experiences with principals on emergent curriculum and working within a 100 Voices environment. And I can remember it clear as day, finishing the presentation. And at the time, district principal Corinne Gannon came up to me and said, "You need to share your story. We're gonna publish this, Tracy." And I kind of looked at her like it completely, the tension that I felt in that moment on what are you talking about? Like, I could never write a book. Like, I'm a struggling reader, right? And but it was her persistence and her belief in me at the time, saying, well, I remember having a meeting with her, and I said, I just don't know where to start. Or sorry, I just don't know where to start. That's what I had said to her, and she said, start anywhere. Like, start in the middle. You just have to, put your fingers on the keyboard and get going. And she was right. But it was her belief in me that allowed me to and my team to publish the early learning book through ECSD, from fairy tales to pirate tales. That is currently a resource that we use in early learning. So we do have opportunities to restory, but it is important that as educators we understand that the labels that we use and the identities that we force on students can have a lingering and lasting impact.
I think we can all think of a time in our own schooling where something happened, and it may have seemed insignificant to the teacher who had said that one comment or done that one thing, but it's stuck with us, and it's been ingrained into our identity. And also that opportunity for restoring, and how that restoring and how that that continues to happen. Like, we're not done learning. Even though we are teachers, we're still students, and we're still learning and moving along this path.
Absolutely. And it's not a matter of me being critical of the teachers that I had. I know that at the time, with the knowledge that we had, they were doing right by me. They were doing the tools that they had. But I think it's a matter of, being cognizant of these things, understanding that the impact that we have and the power that we have as educators, and if we know better, challenge ourselves to do better. So it's not me being critical of anyone in education. We're all on a journey together, and there were things about, again, when I looked at my timeline, there were things that built me up and probably helped me to overcome my reading challenges, and that was related to other storying that happened for me. And that was, I was, part of my being a struggling reader is I was a very busy child who struggled to sit, and I needed to move. But that was also my strength. That was my gift. I was a little athlete, and I was labeled as an athlete. I was, my story and my ability to visualize things, and I can remember visualizing, winning a track and field. I could see it before I did it, and then I would do it. I remember, dreaming and being like, I'm going to be the co-captain of the junior high volleyball team, and then I achieved that. Right. So there were things that, when we talk about storying, there can be really positive things that we can influence, but it's also interesting to me that when I think, even though I'm extremely passionate about primary years in education, I have very little memories about kindergarten and grade 1. So when I think about grade 1, I have one memory, and that is, like, I'm sure I have more if we pick through things, but that come to mind. I have one, and it was about a book that was created, a joint book, and it was about spring. It was spring is coming, this is how I know. And then each person got to draw a picture and write a line. I see pussy willows, the pussy willows tell me so. And I got to take that book home, the class book, and I could interact with that book, and I was successful with that book, right? Because it was repetitive. It had a lot of the scaffolds that I needed as a reader who was struggling. So that is I have zero memory of kindergarten. And so it's interesting to me that, what was that about my experiences? Was it myself protecting myself, or was it that I really did struggle to engage?
What? Are we still doing that? Assigning grades to formative assessments. That's kind of counterintuitive. Formative really means just that, forming, creating the opportunity to shape what the student knows, understands, and is able to do. This is where feedback, timely, relevant, meaningful feedback is critical. If I simply put a 10 out of 10 or a letter grade or something on a formative piece, what is that telling a student? It is not giving them any direct feedback in terms of what's going well, what might need to be improved. Think of, think of it like going to see your doctor. Your doctor is going to maybe give you a prescription, and that's going to figure out what's the problem, what do we need to do to address it, to make it better, to work on it. That's the power of formative assessment. It unlocks those areas conceptually, or the data, the facts, the information that the student really needs to tend to improve their learning. By ascribing that value to it, it diminishes the impact or the intention of formative. Ascribing that mark, that value, should be at the summative end of that formative journey. So there is no need to ascribe a mark or a grade to a formative piece. Just give that feedback and make sure that students understand the intent and the value of that feedback, and that will help them, guide them to greater levels of mastery. I don't know. What do you think?
Okay. So how has this experience influenced the way you approach assessment and grading in your current role?
Well, I think first of all, the biggest way is that it reinforces my belief that relationships are extremely important, whether that's as a teacher working with a student, getting to know families, really having the voice of students within assessment is an integral part of that. But also as a consultant, working with teachers, really the same principles apply, and that relationship is an important part to moving forward in any journey or any learning experience. There has to be trust. There has to be. It's helped me to come into these relationships with understanding and compassion, and try and not put myself in the person's shoes, but take their story into consideration before we move forward on new learning. Because often the experiences that we have, or not often, but always the experience that we've had will shape how we move forward into things. And I never want, whether it's a student or a teacher, to think that I'm coming in as, the person who knows everything, because I don't know everything. I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly reading. I'm trying to grow and find out how to support people better. And I think that if we interact with our students that way, and then they can feel comfortable in having a voice. I also think that these relationships are important because we never totally know, or unless we give space for it, we don't know the experiences that students are having at home. And sometimes some of the work within narrative inquiry, we looked at the concept of world traveling, and how students or even teachers have these experiences, and through their culture and identity, that are completely different. Like the dominant narrative that is at home is completely different than the dominant narrative that is happening in school. And how can we shift that dominant narrative within schools so that students and staff can be themselves, and they don't have to. If you think about the cognitive load that is on an individual who has to be a completely different person at home than at school, it really is that experience of world traveling. So I think, honestly, this experience has helped me to further understand that relationships are critical, and yes, we can put a piece of paper in front of somebody, or an assessment or a test or a quiz or whatever, and we can find out some things that they know. But the depth of understanding, there's limitations that, if based on what our relationship is with those individuals. So I think it just reinforces those ideas that relationships really are a huge part of education, and they need to be, regardless of the grade, the level, anything like that. And I know that there's barriers to sometimes this happening, but as educators, I think we need to do the best that we can within the context and give space for student voices to really shine through within their assessments.
Yeah, I'm holding on to what you said about the cognitive load of being one way at school, because that's the dominant narrative, and then being another way at home, because that's another dominant narrative, and how challenging that could be for a student. Do you want to elaborate a bit more on what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So if you think about, a student who culturally there's expectations related to behavior or what at home is seen as appropriate on how to act, the language that they use, the way they think, the way they interact, even something like eye contact or no eye contact. Like there's little things that different cultures and different environments see differently, right? And then these children or students then have to go to school where there's a whole new set of rules, and where we see behavior in a very specific light. We see social interaction. Even if I think about my experiences with supporting speech and language and talking about joint attention and all of those things that are important for communication. Well, in some cultures, that causes tension because it's not culturally responsive to their culture, right? So I'm not saying that as educators, we have to know everything about every culture, but I think the time invested into finding out about our individual students, and finding ways to find out more about their family and their culture, can help us to bridge those pieces. And why not bring in some of that understanding if we think about equity, diversity, and the journey that we're on, if we think about EDIAR and the journey that we're on with Edmonton Catholic Schools, by bringing in this understanding, this is how we can have compassion, and this is where we'll reach some of those goals. But it also means that student identity can be celebrated instead of asking students to be constantly thinking about which set of rules or expectations they have to live up to in the environment that they're in.
As I've been reading about culturally responsive practice, many of the texts talk about that, just leaving room for student identity to surface in the classroom. And how do you do that? You do that through conversation. You do that through talking. What are some ways that you've found to be successful for allowing for student voice to come into your classrooms?
So my most recent experience, again, was as a teacher in the classroom, was 100 Voices. And again, being at a recreation center, our relationships with families was because the walls of the school kind of were pushed down and families had to drop off their kids. The depth of the relationship with families and our connection to families was very strong. And it's something that I think about often on how could we take the learning and those experiences of being at a rec center and move that into a school especially if you're a large school. So some of the things that we did to develop relationships, well, first of all, it was just that trust and that empathy. Many of the families who came to 100 Voices, their students had identified needs. And so really coming into that with compassion, not looking at a deficit model, trying to focus on strengths, sharing quick wins really quickly with families through videos or photos or pedagogical documentation. That first part allowed or invited parents to be a part of our community, and it also built that foundation of trust where they would feel comfortable being honest with us. Another thing that we did was we had children for lots of reasons. Some of it to do with sometimes our youngest learners have difficulty separating from their families, so we would have representation of their family within our classroom, what through photographs, through maps, we tried to ensure that we had literature within the classroom that was not just represented of a Eurocentric view. We had a family evening always in October where it was a multicultural potluck, and we asked families to bring in an item of food that was part of their family culture. And we do know that there are some families that don't really have an ethnic piece, and so it was like, bring in something that celebrates a tradition or your ethnicity that you celebrate as a family that you want to share with everyone. And for me, it sounds like a really simple thing, but I can visualize one particular grandmother of a student whose was Chinese, and his Mandarin-speaking grandmother who came from China to raise him and his sibling, even though she was a doctor there and was fluent in Chinese, was very high functioning, and then she came to this country where she couldn't communicate in her basic way. But we found ways, and she came to family programming. She learned some basic English. We learned how to gesture and to use Google Translate. And she at our multicultural night took me by the hand and brought me to her food item, and the joy in her face for me experiencing her culture in that moment was it was something that was kind of breathtaking. So, and it really impacted on me. So finding authentic ways to bring culture and identity into the classroom, and also as well as finding ways to establish trust with families who may not have had their own positive experience. So I'm not saying it's an easy thing, and I'm not saying that as educators we can do it with everyone, but by really focusing as much as possible on the small wins with our most complex learners and with any learners, I think you can over time have them understand that you're on their side and you want them to succeed. And ultimately, that's where, regardless of what your tradition is, what your experience is, that's where you'll start to align, right? We can all come together in that we want kids to be successful.
Yeah. You have me reflecting on my own practice right now, and just trying to think of the ways that I brought in community, and I'd like to share them for our listeners, because I taught grade 4 and up, so those older grades where sometimes the parent engagement starts to drop off.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you bring parents into those classrooms? And this strategy is actually not my own. It comes from one of my teachers in my undergrad, Simone Desilets, and she talked about establishing those relationships right off the bat. And too often in education, the first phone call home will be a negative one. Mm-hmm. So in which ways can you as a teacher start a positive conversation? And her idea was start with something that she called appel soleil, or a sunshine call. And I've done it every year since I found out about this. And I call every parent at the beginning of the year, right even before their child walks into the classroom, and you simply ask them 3 questions. Tell me about your child. What are their strengths? What are they great at? And what is your hope for them this year? And these are longer conversations, but they've always been so worth it. It already opens up that communication with the families, and parents feel like they have that opportunity to show who their child is as a person. Mm-hmm. To start.
I think that's so powerful, because I think sometimes our goals from an educational lens, although they can relate to the hopes and dreams of a family, sometimes they're not completely aligned. And I'm not saying, we should veer from our educational goals, but if we can have that lens of the hopes and dreams of the family as we move forward educationally, I think we can actually do justice to both. And again, it's another way to find those connections, especially as we work through individualized program plans and things like that. Really having parent voice and student voice where applicable right off the bat, before the goals are even concretely established, having that voice when, if and when possible, I think again builds that relationship and helps that buy-in piece. So that's very exciting.
So this episode of the podcast is airing at a transition time between summer and the fall. So do you have any advice for teachers moving forward, how we can start engaging in this reflective practice with a new year starting?
Well, I think like anything, one of the pieces is that we have to plan for it and give space and time for it. So if at all possible, put it into your schedule and make it routine, right? And I think that if you get to that place where it becomes routine, what you'll notice is that the reflective process will happen naturally after engaging in experiences with kids. Off the bat, just like anything, when we're learning something new, we need to think about it and make space for it. But as you move forward, I think that it really is something that will begin to happen naturally for you. The other thing is, and I've mentioned this before, but having a team or somebody who you can reflect with or alongside is very powerful as well. You can have those initial pieces and then have the conversation with a trusted colleague, somebody who you can be honest with, because there's in education we always have the goal of doing right and doing the best we can for children, but sometimes things don't go exactly how we want. So reflecting on that, being okay in that world of discomfort and having that cognitive dissonance or that tension that is experienced in that moment, being okay with it, because if we think about it as a learning experience and we put things in place to change or to rectify that or to restore things back to the way they should be, then I think that it's okay. And so having space and somebody that's trusted to have those conversations can help you to move forward and to maybe have some different perspective. But the first thing, like I said, is make it part of your planning and give space for it, dedicate some time so that it can become routine.
Well, thanks so much, Tracy. We're going to end off with one last question that I'm asking to all my guests moving forward, and you can answer this however you wish to answer it. What's a dream you have for education?
That's a big one. My dream for education. Well, I think, when I think about my most recent work and even the conversation today, my dream for education is that it would be a place of belonging. And I know that sounds it's so huge. I think it's impacted by my work as an assessment and reporting consultant, our work as a division with new curriculum. So if we, have a space that honors the principles of universal designs for learning, where we have multiple means and ways for students to interact with curriculum in an educational place where their voice is honored and they can see themselves in the institution of school. That would be, for me, I think that would be outstanding and amazing, and is my dream for education and for students at large. So I would love to see that happen within our division.
Belonging,
absolutely.
Thanks so much for being on the podcast today. We'll link the textbook Narrative Inquiry by Clandinin and Conley in the episode description.
Perfect. Thanks for having me today.
Before we end today's episode, I would like to thank Tracy for sharing her story. For me, stories are so impactful as I reflect on my own journey in education and make plans for the future. I hope that this podcast tells stories that help you in your own life. Thank you to both Nicole Lafreniere and Tim Cusack for their segments. And last but not least, to you, our listeners, thank you for tuning in to The Learning Curve. Please follow us at ECSD Learning and check out our many resources on our SharePoint site, bit.ly/assessment-ECSD. The links are in the episode description. That's our time. See you next time on The Learning Curve.